All right, so it looks like we've got about 20 people here. We'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. Just want to thank everybody again for joining us for this first community meeting to discuss the Ward Road Corridor Study. I wanted to introduce the project team here. I'm Adam Lynn, the Bicycle and Pedestrian Coordinator for the City of Arvada. With us, we also have John Ferruzzi, the Mobility and Innovation Division Manager with the City of Arvada as well. And then we have Trung Vo and Rachel Finfer with our consultant team, Tool Design Group. So just to go over our presentation tonight, I'm going to start with a little bit of background and purpose of this project. We'll discuss the schedule, talk about the corridor profile, some of the existing conditions that we've already analyzed and data we've collected, and then we'll talk about our public input process and then go to a Q&A session. So to start with the background and purpose, the real reason we've initiated this study is that the 2017 Bicycle Master Plan identified Ward Road as the #2 capital project and recommended separated bike lanes. However, the bike plan's kind of at that 30,000 foot level, and so it really doesn't get into the details of how is this actually going to be implemented. Is it going to be on one side of the road, both sides of the road? Is it going to be the same throughout the whole corridor? And so that's kind of the initiative that led us to this point. The corridor also serves as a connection to the G-Line station and both the Van Bibber Creek Trail and Ralston Creek Trail, which are major recreation and commuting destinations for people bicycling and walking. There's also commercial along the corridor and connections to residential and schools in the surrounding areas. It's a major north-south corridor that's lacking bicycle infrastructure, and the results from this study will help ready the city for future grant applications. So what are our goals? As I mentioned, the study will take a more detailed look at the need and feasibility of that bicycle plan recommendation for separated bike lanes. One of the main questions that we want to look at and get feedback on is a shared use path, a better solution. So instead of having a separate bike lane and a separate sidewalk or trail, is it possible and more feasible to combine all the users into a separate shared use path on both sides of the roadway? Another question that we have is it a standard recommendation for the entire length of the corridor from north to south, or is it going to differ in different sections? As Trung will talk about in a little bit, the corridor has some different characteristics, so it's not necessary that the recommendations would be the same. Our main goals from this project are both to produce short-term recommendations and a long-term vision for walking and bicycling in the corridor. So we want to, from this study, we want to have some specific projects, widen sidewalk to trail between point A and point B. That's something we can fund and build in the short term, but also have those long-term goals about whether it's a total shared use path or separated bike lanes or standard bike lanes, kind of whatever those recommendations are for the long term. So as redevelopment occurs, and if there's any future roadway improvements, that we would have that recommendation and include that in that design process. Lastly, the project has scoped a small amount of funding for a demonstration project in a section of the corridor. So what that is to be determined, but whether it's a few blocks of a separated bike lane, some kind of new crossing, new features, we're open to trying and testing something out here before we go into a major, largely funded improvement. So at a high level, the goals of the study is to create a multimodal corridor that is safe and comfortable for people walking, bicycling, using transit, and driving. And some of our tasks that we're going to look at the potential is to reduce the number of speeding vehicles along the corridor, provide safe and comfortable bicycle facilities, and to upgrade sidewalks, curb ramps, and street crossings to make sure they're meeting ADA requirements and feeling safe and comfortable for all users. So we just wanted to touch base here and share this. These are the recommendations from the bike plan. On the left, you can see what's called a level of stress map. Basically, the red is kind of the more stressful, and so as you can imagine, where there's no bike lanes, narrow sidewalks, 5 lanes of traffic, most of that is high stress, where only your very dedicated, or some might say crazy people would want to ride a bike on the street. But then as you get north of 64th and 65th, where the corridor changes and there's existing bike lanes, that level of stress drops from 3 and then to 2 as well. And then over here on the right, we have the bike lane recommendations from the bike master plan. The purple shows where we propose separated, and then the blue is a small section of buffered bike lanes. So these are the recommendations that either A, we want to look at the feasibility and how to implement them and in what style, or do we kind of want to say, hey, we've done a second study at more detail and we have a better recommendation for this corridor. And so we wanted just to touch base on separated bike lanes. They're new in the city. We don't really have any fully built out yet. There's a small section of a two-way separated bike lane at that 70th and Ward intersection with the trail that some of you may have seen, but we don't really have any of these fully built out. So a separated bike lane is a bike lane that's separated from the roadway both horizontally and also has vertical deflection. So as you can see in these pictures, there's either pieces of curb or a connected curb all the way along the bike lane that really separates it from the roadway. And a separated bike lane is a little bit different from a trail, and that is just dedicated for bicyclists. So in these two pictures, it's not actually what we would consider ideal because there's not also a pedestrian facility for people to walk as well. So this is kind of just, we don't have these, so we wanted to show some pictures of separated bike lanes, whereas Arvada is we have a really good trail network, and so we figure everybody is familiar with shared use paths and trails. And so with that, I will turn it over to Trung for the next section of the presentation.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I want to touch on the schedule a little bit, and through this this schedule, I'll also just talk about the process. So there's really 4 distinct elements to the planning process when it comes to a corridor study. Community engagement, where we engage you, the public, and other interested stakeholders. That happens kind of across the timeline of the project. But what you see in kind of dark green for existing conditions analysis, that's what we've done so far. We've looked at traffic volumes and crash data and existing geometry. So myself and Rachel will touch on that in just a few slides. So we've kind of gotten through that point. The next stage, the next phase is developing alternatives for what the concept could look like for the corridor, and then narrowing that down to a preferred concept closer to the end of that phase. And then the final piece is final documentation, right? Putting it all together, explaining the process, describing how we got to where we get to, and then making a case for further design and funding and implementation into the future. So where we are today is the first community public meeting. And then we're also going to have another one later in the spring, early summer, to get your feedback on the concepts that we come up with. So we have two touch points through this public meeting today, as well as through Speak Up to provide your input. So moving on to the next slide, we're going to dive into sort of the nitty gritty of what this corridor looks like, how it operates, what it looks like physically, how folks are traveling along the roadway. And we're going to start with classification and ownership, actually ownership. And so it's just good to keep in mind on this slide that the ownership changes over the course of this of Ward Road, this roadway, from 52nd all the way up to 72nd. There's a section in there that's maintained by Colorado Department of Transportation. North of 64th, the roadway is maintained by the city of Arvada. And then there's a section that's maintained by CDOT that's within Wheat Ridge to the south. So then moving on to the next slide, let's talk about classifications. Roadway classification is just a really simple way for transportation planners and engineers to think about the function and the expectations for a roadway. And we'll actually talk a little bit about what these roadways actually look like. But the way that they function is that south of 64th, it's a state highway, right? And that state highway ends up going west onto 64th. But north of 64th, Ward Road is considered to be an arterial. And so that's just kind of one more input that we need to think about when we're considering what these roadways roads, what the roadway is expected to do and how it's expected to function moving into the future. So then moving on to the next slide, we'll just point out some differences in the cross section. So as I mentioned, north of 64th Ward Road is maintained by the city of Arvada. So north is actually pointing to the right of your screen. In the cross section, the image on the north or on the top right side of the screen shows what the roadway looks like today. Right now, there's a travel lane in each direction for drivers. There's a central left turn lane for two-way left turns. There's also bike lanes and parking on both sides. But then when you get to south of 64th, the roadway opens up a little bit, right? I'm sure you know, either living or working or driving along this corridor, it feels different. And part of the reason is because there's more travel lanes. That's a pretty obvious one. And in certain sections south of 64th, there are also sort of these dedicated right turn lanes outside of the travel lanes, right? So in some cases, the cross section gets fairly wide. But we do know that for the most part, the sidewalks are connected. There are some gaps that this project will eventually, hopefully, seek to fill. But one of the glaring omissions right now is how do you get along this roadway? How do you travel on the roadway if you're riding on a bicycle? So then moving on to the next slide, I want to touch on that a little bit. As I mentioned, there are a few small sidewalk gaps, and there are existing bike lanes, conventional bike lanes to the north, north of 64th. And if you've had the chance to travel along the Ralston Creek Trail recently in the last year or so, you will have seen this two-way separated bike lane on Ward Road. It accommodates a connection and a crossing across Ward Road. And so so in addition to sidewalks and bike facilities, we're also thinking about how all of this interacts with transit, right? You know, once we're post-pandemic and travel patterns maybe return a little bit back to normal, it may not return all the way back to what we had experienced before COVID, but we do expect greater levels of folks commuting, and especially by transit, right? So this corridor, there are a couple of existing RTD routes along the corridor that we're just going to need to think about. So imagine if you're walking or biking from a bus stop to your destination, whether it be a place of employment or a restaurant or the trails or a park. How do you actually get there? Does it feel comfortable to transition from bicycling and walking to taking the bus or vice versa? And then obviously the connection to the G line at the south end of the corridor. And then on the next slide, I just want to touch on the intersections along the corridor. There's 5 existing signals. So there's one at 52nd Avenue, one at 58th Avenue, one at 64th Avenue, one at 72nd Avenue, and then there's that signalized crossing for the Ralston Creek Trail south of in the northern section. And then there's also a grade separated crossing of the Van Beaver Creek Trail, so you don't actually have to cross the road. You can cross under the road to continue along the trail. And then on the next slide, there are just some representative images of what we couldn't help but notice while we were out there, right? So there are some sections of the roadway where the sidewalk feels sufficiently wide, you know, ranging from 8 to 9 to 10 feet, but there isn't necessarily a buffer between the sidewalk and the roadway, and so it may not feel as comfortable as it could be. In other situations, you know, we saw signage indicating the presence of people walking and people biking, which is really great. It's just another way to alert motorists to be safe and to watch out for other road users. And then also that connection at the Ralston Creek Trail presents a really great opportunity. It's a really creative. It was a very sort of innovative and creative way to approach a problem of getting people across the street, especially people bicycling. How do you do that when with limited funding and limited capacity? You can do something kind of in a pilot way to test it out, and that's one location that we intend to think about and evaluate and then integrate into the concept design. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Rachel Binford to talk about some of the data collection that we did along the corridor.
All right, thanks so much, Trung. So I'm going to touch on traffic volumes and speeds. And this is just one of the pieces that we looked at to get a good understanding of what's going on today along the corridor. And as you can see here, and as you might expect based on the classification that Trung mentioned, where a portion of the corridor is functioning as a state highway, we do see higher volumes in that southern portion, motor vehicle volumes. As far as, and that's indicated by the ADT column, that's average daily traffic. And then as far as speeds, they do vary along the corridor. These are motor vehicle speeds. They range from 33 miles all the way up to 43 miles per hour. And the real takeaway here is that given these speeds and volumes, the recommended bike facility based on national guidance would be something that is separated and separates bicyclists from motor vehicle traffic. On the next slide, we also looked at the bicycle and pedestrian volumes at that Ralston Creek Trail crossing. And what we can see here is that, there are significant volumes of bicyclists and pedestrians crossing at Ralston Creek Trail. So we know that we need to safely accommodate those crossings. I'll also note that with this data was collected on a Friday, and we did see the peak hours were between 10 and 11 a.m. and 5 to 6 p.m. Just for more information there. Next, we also looked at crash data, and crash data, of course, is really important because we're going to be considering safety for all users through this project. So we went ahead and looked at crash data from 2015 through 2019. And we saw 411 total crashes during that time frame, including 9 crashes that resulted in either a serious injury or a fatality. We're referring to those as KSI, or killed or severely injured crashes. There were 3 crashes that involved pedestrians, 2 of which were KSI crashes, and there were also 4 crashes that involved bicyclists. So important considerations, certainly. We dug into this a little bit further. We looked at what are the top crash types and what's actually happening in these crashes. And you can see these on the right here. We know that rear end crashes are a big factor, as well as right angle crashes, and some of the others are listed there as well. So the next slide highlights a little bit more into those top crash locations. You can see the turquoise circle around those just to call them out. 64th and 58th Avenue they really rise to the top for crash frequency and severity, given there are KSIs happening there. Those are those killed and severely injured crashes. 63rd also has a significant crash history. So this is going to be really important context for us. The last thing I'll touch on before handing it back to Adam is, we're also looking at, what else is going on along the corridor, what else is planned, what other projects are happening. And there are 2 developments that are currently in progress or in various stages of the planning and development process. The first is actually in Wheat Ridge, in the city of Wheat Ridge. That's at the very southern end of the corridor, right to the left of the screen. So these are new townhome residences within the city of Wheat Ridge. And as part of that, there have been new sidewalks recently constructed on the east side of Ward. And then the second project is within the city of Arvada. That's that Sabel Park. It's a park and residential. So it's detached single family houses and townhome residences, as well as a new city of Arvada park. So we're looking at the improvements that project is making as well. It's going to be partially completing an existing portion of the sidewalk gap. So that's great. So those are all things we're considering in this project. There are also a few planned transportation projects along the corridor that we're going to be aligning and taking into consideration. So with that, I will turn it back to Adam. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so we're just going to wrap up and talk about the public input process and then the next steps in the project. So as we touched on earlier, we do have a steering committee. It's made up of community members and staff from the city of Arvada, CDOT, Wheat Ridge, Bike Friendly Arvada, the Arvada Parks and Transportation Committees, the Arvada Police Department, and a few others. So they're kind of our core group that we're discussing this project with. We'll be bouncing ideas off and getting direction from them, kind of as a pulse on the public community. But obviously everybody is able to give their own individual feedback via this meeting and via Speak Up Arvada. So they'll be looking at the existing conditions, helping us with concept design development, kind of evaluating our designs and giving us feedback. So as we finalize those processes and the outcomes that we're going to be recommending, and then the documentation review. So in addition, we also have the Speak Up page. Many of you probably were made aware of this meeting and this project through the Speak Up page already. We're currently accepting input until Sunday, February 7th at 11:59 p.m. And there is, you can always use this page as a way to keep up with the project, find out any resources or any new updates in terms of the recommendations. But we're also mainly have a survey and an interactive map there that you can use to identify issues, tell us about destinations you want to walk or bike to, what kind of infrastructure you think is needed, kind of any feedback you'd like to give to the project team. And so when you go to the Speak Up page, if you scroll down, these are kind of those two items. There's an interactive map here where you can click go to map, and you can kind of use the different features there to kind of geotag and put in comments and information. And then there's also just a brief survey. I think it's about 8 questions, just to give us some feedback about if you're already biking or walking on the corridor, what destinations are you going to, and how you're getting there. So with that, our next steps are to wrap up this initial public input phase. Like I said, it's got about another week and a half left. We'll review the feedback, and our team will put that all together and discuss with our steering committee as we develop those recommendations, what the public wants to see and prioritize. From that process, we're going to develop an interactive web map that'll show the recommendations. And again, similar to this map, allow the public to weigh in and say whether they agree, disagree, want to see something different. Also be able to hopefully rank priorities, so where we should focus our funding if we get it as we develop the projects in the future. We'll have a second public meeting around the same time to discuss the recommendations, why we chose those, and get feedback. After that, we'll finalize both those short-term and long-term recommendations. We'll identify a location for the demonstration project and what that's going to entail. And then we will release the final study and recommendations to the public. So, we're going to continue this process and keep the public engaged and keep you all giving us feedback as we develop our recommendations, and hopefully get to build something here in the near future. So with that, just want to open it up for questions, and you can put these in the chat if you'd like, or give us your feedback. What exactly is your hope for what Ward Road would look like in the future? And with that, I will stop the share, and John, you can go through the questions. Let us know what we need to answer. Thanks.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, so the first question for the panel here is, what are the potential impacts to traffic flow?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on what the recommendations are that we come up with. If it's mainly behind kind of like those separated bike lanes or shared use paths behind the curb, really wouldn't be any kind of significant impact to travel time or traffic impacts. We had a discussion with CDOT a few weeks ago, and we're not proposing to remove any lanes or do anything at intersections that would have any severe or major impacts to traffic flow. I think all the intersections already have pedestrian signals, and so any new trails or anything would be tied into that signal timing.
Okay, thank you. The second question is, does the type of path, shared versus bike only, have any impacts on e-bike usage?
Not really. I think at this time the city's going through the process of updating our ordinances, and we got some pretty solid support from council at a meeting a few weeks ago to allow e-bikes on all of our trails. And in this situation, it's a little different since it's part of the roadway, so it kind of follows a different set of standards that the state's already adopted to allow e-bikes on roadways.
Okay, thank you. Another question. This one is there a plan to repave Ward Road?
I think the easy answer is yes, it will be repaved at some point in the future. But I don't think we have any plans immediate, at least for the Arvada side, and we can check in with CDOT to see where the south of 64th is on their repaving plan. So we can get back to you.
And Adam, maybe I can help answer that question too. Recently, the section between 64th and 72nd Avenue was repaved about 4 to 5 years ago, if I remember correctly.
And yeah, and so it's normally like a 10+ year cycle for repaving, so.
All right, the next question is, so if I heard you, there are no longer any buses running north-south on Ward Road from 72nd to 64th.
I can answer this. I believe there are currently no buses running north-south. South of 58th, there are a couple of routes. I think it's number 52 and number 72 that do run along Ward at the northern extent.
All right, the next question is, what will happen to the Wayne Lund Trail?
Can you repeat that, John?
What will happen to the Wayne Lund Trail? I'm not aware of this trail along this corridor.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with it. If you can provide some more information, or we can get back to you separately. But anything that's already existing, we're not planning to eliminate. You know, at a high level, like sidewalks would be widened, trails would be connected to if they exist, but we wouldn't be eliminating any existing trails.
Okay. The next question is a connection from Ward to Wyndham Meadow Lake Trail being considered? Connecting a sidewalk trail on Ward to that trail could make it easier for the neighborhood to get around by biking or walking.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great piece of input. So, you know, we're kind of in that phase of collecting all these little nooks and crannies that the community knows about, and we can definitely look at that as we develop our recommendations.
All right. The next question is this project already funded? What is the time frame to start and completion?
Yeah, so the funded piece of this project is just for the study. So we have this small amount of money that we're doing to develop the study, and then from there, we'll be evaluating which projects kind of look good, which ones can we use our local funding to match with a grant. For example, on Alkire Street, we recently got a grant for a sidewalk piece that's about $1.5 million. And so the city is putting in $300,000 and the federal match is $1.2 million. So that's really what we're looking at for future projects. And from this study, once we have kind of better recommendations on what projects and some cost estimates, it's easier for us to go to a council and the city manager to discuss capital project requests.
All right, the next question is there enough right-of-way to consider protected bike lanes through the entire corridor?
That's what we don't know, and that's one of the questions that we'll be looking at. But yeah, that's one of the main reasons that we're getting into this more detailed study, is that we just don't really have enough information from the bicycle master plan level.
All right, the next question is, will there be a crossing for Yankee Doodle Trail where it crosses Ward Road?
That's another thing that we'll look into more specifically and see what's feasible and what's the best and safest connection. So thanks for adding that.
All right, the next question is, what are the state plans for replacing the bridge at Ralston Creek? It is a major choke point for the floodplain and will need to have a major change in elevations along Ward.
That's something we can follow up with CDOT on and get their feedback and see what the kind of structural integrity and the replacement schedule is for that bridge. So we can get back to you if you leave your email in the comment here or reach out to one of us directly after the meeting.
All right. The next question is, are there any close parallel streets that can be used instead of Ward Road itself?
Not really. We kind of looked at that as, you know, that's sometimes a safer and easier alternative, but there really isn't any long connecting sections of north-south roadways. So it'd be a lot of zigzagging and out of the way, walking or bicycling. And so that's kind of why we decided to focus on actually making improvements to Ward Road itself.
All right. The next question is, since there are several steep hills on Ward, is consideration being given to allow for passing slow-moving bikes or pedestrians?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and definitely something we'll take into our design considerations as we develop those recommendations. Especially, I think the biggest thing is with e-bikes becoming more popular, than those really build in a speed difference, especially on some of the uphill sections that Ward Road has.
I believe there's a similar question as well. It says, I feel the hills are very blinding to see over on Ward. Is there a plan to make sure bikers are protected from the vehicles?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we'll be looking at, both kind of along Ward Road and then also for the crossings at some of those sight distance issue locations. So it might not be something that's easily fixable in the short term, but the long-term plan could have a better improvement for something at those points. So if you have any specific ones, feel free to go to Speak Up and use that map to call those out specifically so we know to take a deeper dive there.
All right, the next question is, if the city pursues a buffered bike lane, can we ensure that that bollards or other physical barriers are installed? For example, the buffered bike lanes along Pomona Drive near Lake Arbor has striping for a buffer, but cars park in it because they aren't physical barriers.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's something that we're starting to do in the city. I think, as we mentioned, at the crossing there at Ward and the Ralston Creek Trail, we kind of have that small section, and just a little tangent on West 72nd Avenue with the roadway widening. We have a separated bike lane coming in, and then we also have a few other projects that we're looking at. So we are definitely looking to add in those physical barriers. And then just on a street like Ward Road that has high volumes and high speeds, we'd really be focusing on some kind of concrete curb versus flex posts with speeds that high. So if we go that route, that's definitely what we'll be looking at for safety.
The constituent asking about Wayne Len Trail has clarified that it's near the entrance of Vanderbilt Creek Park and shows up on the Arvada Trail map. Just an FYI.
We'll get into that. Thanks.
All right, the next question is, are there any plans to have the bike path tunnel under Ward Road? I know it's major dollars, but there are a lot of traffic across Ward, and yes, there's a light.
Yeah, so I think our long-term plan here will look at that intersection and see if grade separation is the best way, or if some kind of redesign of that intersection to help it work better for people walking, biking, and driving. So it's definitely something we'll look at, and please go to that map and add that point in there and comment if you will.
All right, the next question is, will there be a delay in implementing this project since the city is dealing with CDOT due to a large portion of the road being a state highway?
Yeah, so just to clarify again, this phase of the project is just for planning. So we don't have the idea yet or funding for actually building, whether it's the bike lane or the shared use path. So this is kind of the initial phase, but we have coordinated with CDOT and have them on our stakeholder committee to make sure that the recommendations that we put forward are ones that CDOT's okay with, and we'll be happy to kind of partner with us and let us work on those projects, even on the state highway portion.
All right, and the last question that I have for the panel is, will this corridor be a pilot that will be followed on other arterials or major streets?
So I think it's something that we are intending to do more of these studies to get some more detailed information where we need it, and engage the public and have those recommendations that are kind of on the ground level, ground verified, and then we can have cost estimates, and then that'll allow us to take the process to apply for grants and CIP funding. So in that phase, kind of, yes, I don't know if I would use the phrase pilot project, but it is something that we're hoping to do more as funding is available, to make these improvements on these corridors that have kind of been passed over for bicyclists and pedestrians in the past, but where there's really not any good viable alternative. So we do hope to continue this process and expand it to other corridors in the future.
All right, and there was a question earlier that I wanted to share. The question was, why is consideration not being given to sections south of Ridge Road to 44th Avenue? This is something that I responded to, that Ward Road south of 52nd Avenue is within the city of Wheat Ridge. However, we are, as part of our project, coordinating with the city of Wheat Ridge, and their representative is part of our stakeholder group.
Yeah, and for us, with the G line being such a big destination and just being like another block south of the city border, it would be one of those kind of silly things that we get reprimanded for by the public for just cutting it short of a main destination. So we did want to we do have to cut the project at a limit, and since it's mainly city funded, that's kind of where we decided to cut it off at the G line station.
Well, panelists, looks like those are all the questions that I have so far. Is there any additional information you'd like to provide?
No, I just want to thank everybody for attending, and all the questions are really good. Again, go to the Speak Up page and give us your feedback there. You can always email myself or John if you have any further questions or want any more one-on-one discussion about any topics. So with that, we'll be respectful of everybody's time and have a good evening, and thanks again.